Good afternoon, everybody. If you could start taking your seats, for those who haven't yet, we're going to start very shortly. Thanks very much. I'm sure you all know about 145 million people, more than that, in fact, in need of humanitarian assistance around the world, more than 65 million forcibly displaced. There are growing risks of climate-driven natural hazards, food insecurity on the rise, and 4 countries trying to stave off famine at the moment. This is as often as there has been, this is a key time to think about how we best respond through our humanitarian system. To that end, we're delighted to welcome, less than 2 months into his new position as the Emergency Relief Coordinator and Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Mark Locog. As the UN's lead for global relief activities, he is charged with coordinating how humanitarian agencies respond and work together to address global emergencies. So in a second, Mark, I'm going to invite you up to the podium to give us some remarks, just a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, if you're watching on the live stream, good afternoon. Please silence your phones, but we do encourage you to tweet using the hashtag CGDTalks, which you can see on the screen there. After Mark's comments, he'll sit down and will be joined by our President Masood Ahmed for a conversation, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience. So with that, Mark, welcome, and I'm going to ask you to take the podium. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for coming and for dialing in. I have got a full text that we prepared for this, but what I'm going to give you now is the sort of edited highlights. The full text will be available on my Twitter account imminently. That's a little incentive for those of you not yet wise enough to be among my Twitter followers. I'm really delighted to be here. I'm a big fan of think tanks, the good ones anyway. And yes, you are in that category. I've read all the league tables. And there are not enough good think tanks in the humanitarian space. So I am really, really pleased that CGD is joining that club. I don't think you will have a more avid or attentive follower than me. I've also inherited a fantastic policy group in OCHA, and my view is that their work and your work will both be improved by dialogue and collaboration. I'm also really pleased to be talking today in the place which is the home of the decision makers of the world's largest and most generous humanitarian financier here in Washington. So I want to talk about what I've inherited as I come into the role as the Emergency Relief Coordinator. Today's my 43rd day. I think perhaps these are the longest 43 days I have enjoyed for some time in my professional life. What I've inherited is a global humanitarian system that's more effective than ever before, thanks in no small measure to the tens of thousands of brave aid workers who populate it, but also a humanitarian system that is under a lot of strain. I want to say something about the opportunity I think we now have to ease that strain and how I'm hoping working with others to play a part in doing that, and in particular, how the policy and research community can help with that. Let me first, though, take you to Difa in Niger. Niger, as you know, is the poorest country in the world, and Difa is the poorest district in the poorest country. Suffered from years of underdevelopment, climate shocks, poverty, less than fantastic governance for much of its history, and for the last 8 years also suffered the violence and barbarity of armed groups like Boko Haram. 400,000 people need humanitarian assistance in Difa, but it's a place that sadly gets not its share of the international attention. And that was one of the reasons why I decided that Difa should be the first place I visited as the emergency relief coordinator. I went to a village called Ngagam near the border with Nigeria. It's a place that had a pre-crisis population of just 1,000 people and now has 13,000. And that's just a subset of the hundreds of thousands of people who have had to relocate fleeing the activities of Boko Haram. They've all fled unspeakable atrocities and violence. They can't return to their homes, either because their homes were destroyed or because it's still too dangerous. While I was there, among the people I talked to was a 30-year-old woman called Aichatu. She'd fled Nigeria to Ngagam with her 4 young children, and she survives now with help from UN agencies and NGOs and the other international relief agencies who've scaled up support significantly over the last 12 months. But she remains in the IDP camp where she, with her kids, are, terrified of violence and abduction, and every night she takes her 4 kids into the bush, running the risk of disease and snake bites because she thinks that's where they are safer than they would be in the IDP camp. She wants to go home to Nigeria, but it's not safe. So the reason I tell you this story is because I think it exemplifies some of the big questions we face in the modern set of humanitarian crises my organisation and lots of yours are dealing with. How do we protect vulnerable communities caught up in conflict? How do we find sustainable solutions to long-term displacement? How do we deal with the root causes of vulnerability, underdevelopment, and people's lack of resilience? And in particular, how do we do better to prevent violence, including staggering levels of sexual violence and abuse committed especially against women and girls? Those are the big questions in Difa, but they're also the big questions that apply across much of the world's humanitarian complexity and the volume of crisis that we're dealing with. I'm a person whose glass is always half full, so let me just tell you a bit about the positives. The humanitarian system is saving lives and protecting people on a scale never achieved before. You heard the numbers of the caseload. Tens of millions of people are reached every year through humanitarian response, and millions of lives are saved every year. Just give you 3 examples of that. These examples are important both to recognise our generous financiers and the work of tens of thousands of aid workers who put their lives on the line providing help for others. A year ago, lots of us were worried about the prospect of 4 famines in 2017. The Secretary-General briefed the Security Council yesterday on what's happened, and those famines have largely been averted in Somalia, South Sudan, Lake Chad Basin, and in Yemen. 13 million people reached with life-saving assistance. The UN and its partners mobilized, the donors released funding quickly, the right interventions were prioritized, including immunization and therapeutic feeding programs, and as I say, millions of lives were saved. But the problem is not solved, and I'm going to come back to that. Last week I was in Bangladesh to support efforts to help more than 500,000. As of today's briefing to me on the phone this morning from Cox's Bazar, 539,000 Rohingya refugees, including 14,000 who have crossed just in the last 48 hours. This exodus, as I said to the press in Geneva last week, is not necessarily over yet. But since the 25th of August, when it started, the UN High Commission for Refugees, World Food Programme, UNICEF, UNFPA, International Organization for Migration, and all their national and international partners have combined just in those 6 or 7 weeks to deliver 17 million food rations, water and sanitation support to 300,000 people, health and immunization for more than 200,000, shelter kits to 150,000, education support of various sorts to about 50,000. The system can mobilize quickly when it's called into action. Take another example. The humanitarian response to the liberation of Mosul in Iraq, where my deputy Ursula Muller was just a few weeks ago. The caseload we've been dealing with there far surpassed our worst case planning assumptions, but humanitarian operations nevertheless kept up with the bigger than expected caseload. The emergency camps were built in record time, stocks were pre-positioned. There was a quite good collaboration relative to other examples we've seen between the civilian authorities and the military authorities, especially in eastern Mosul, to contain the impact on civilians of the military activity. Secondly, humanitarian workers, brave and committed people, deserve recognition and protection. Humanitarians come from all backgrounds. When I was in Maiduguri in Borno in northeast Nigeria a few weeks ago, I met a woman who had just stopped being a domestic science teacher in a secondary school and is now working for the International Organization for Migration. And I asked her, so why did you do that? And she said the thing that humanitarians always say to you when you ask that question, to make a difference. Too often, aid workers become casualties of the violence around them. Just this year so far, more than 90 aid workers have been killed in deliberate acts of violence. This is unacceptable. All perpetrators of such violence need to know that there will ultimately be accountability. Third, though, the humanitarian system is under strain. The numbers that we're dealing with are bigger than they've ever been before. The overall funding for appeals has grown in recent years, but it's not kept pace with the caseload. So between 2007 and 2009, 72% of the requirements in appeals were funded. That number fell to 61% between 2013 and 2016. 2017, we have our largest ever aggregated UN appeal, $24 billion. We have our largest ever for this stage of the year response, $11 billion. But the gap is still growing. So amidst all this, what are the opportunities? Last year in Istanbul at the World Humanitarian Summit, thousands of people from 180 member states and from the humanitarian and development communities gathered to support a change agenda which puts the people affected by crisis at the center of action. The overarching vision for that, the Agenda for Humanity, remains a valid vision. It reinforces the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and what we need to do now is keep up the momentum to deliver on the many commitments that were made. The Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, rang me in April to ask me to take on this job. I think he was encouraged to do that by a number of people. And the main reason I was keen to accept is that I think the vision that he set out for reforming the United Nations to make us fit for the 21st century is the most persuasive I have seen in more than 30 years working on these issues. And that reform, if we implement it, should both reduce the need for humanitarian assistance and make it more effective. We can talk more in the Q&A session, perhaps, about where we are on that reform programme, including the join up of humanitarian and development action. One of the things we're doing is putting in place a steering committee, which is being chaired by the Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed, to bring together the humanitarian actors and the development actors, especially in the UN system, but also with the World Bank, with the support of the leader of the UN's development system, Achim Steiner, and me as the emergency relief coordinator. We see enormous opportunity also to build a new partnership with the World Bank to the same ends of accelerating development, reducing the need for humanitarian response, and joining up better. In my last job, I spent a lot of time and energy encouraging the bank to play a more active role in fragile states and dealing with crises, especially refugee crises. The shareholders of the bank, through generous contributions to IDA 18, have now put in place a big boost to that work for the next 3 years. And I think the bank has a real opportunity to bring its expertise and finance to bear in places where the poorest and most vulnerable and those most likely to be affected by humanitarian crises are. And I think in Jim Kim and Kristalina Georgieva, we have leaders who understand the benefits of the bank as a leader of the wider development system and the humanitarian system collaborating more and engaging more. I really appreciate the role Kristalina's playing in continuing to champion the grand bargain. I think the examples we've seen already of collaboration between the bank and humanitarians give us great cause for optimism for the future. I think what the bank and UNICEF are doing on social protection in Yemen, the bank's recent grant to the ICRC in Somalia, the work on risk financing, the way the refugee window has already started to be used in Uganda, and the discussions that you've seen publicised earlier this week on how that window can be used in Bangladesh are just a few examples of what can grow to be a really powerful and effective collaboration. I'm also struck in terms of opportunity by the number of new actors from civil society, the private sector and local organisations contributing to humanitarian action and wanting to do more. Let me now just say a word about what I'm hoping to contribute to myself over the next few years in this role. In OCHA, I have inherited an organisation that is full of brilliant, capable, committed, passionate people. What we are trying, my Deputy Ursula Muller and I, to do is put in place a set of arrangements, build an organisation where those people can all do their best work. Based on the reform plan that we inherited, we're restructuring OCHA to focus on 5 core functions: advocacy, coordination, humanitarian financing, information management, and policy. We're trying to build a culture that is collaborative. Our role is to offer a coordination service. We're not an agency. We are not operational in the sense that we don't and we won't implement programs ourselves. But we want to be fantastic coordinators. And good coordinators, in my experience, listen well, they're facilitative, they're supportive, they're helpful, they're often behind the scenes. And if our delivery partners, the UN agencies, the Red Cross, the NGOs, start in the course of my tenure in this job to describe us in that way, I will think we are doing the things we should be doing. We also need in OCHA to be financially sustainable. For too long, we have spent more money than we've received in income. Our generous donors, whose voluntary contributions pay for 95% of what we do, are clear about the financing that they can offer, and we have to adjust to that. That is not about doing more with less. It's about doing less, but doing it better. So we're going to become more focused on the things that we do well, the things that our partners want us to do. And let me be clear about one thing. Given the structure of the humanitarian system, OCHA's role is not optional. Our role is indispensable. The issue is how we discharge it well. Beyond creating a better OCHA, I would like, when I move on from this role in however many years from now, to leave a system in which 3 big problems are dealt with better. Firstly, we need to find a way to address the behaviour of combatants in conflict. The international laws of war are being routinely violated. Typically, people commit these heinous crimes if they think they won't be seen, or they won't be caught, or they won't be punished. I think the question of how to change the behaviour of belligerents is ripe for better research and policy thinking, in addition to the persistent advocacy and constructive dialogue that we already do. When it comes to accountability, first let's ensure that violations are witnessed. We live in a world in which technology companies have access to enormous amounts of information across all parts of the world. Can we collaborate with them to collect and catalogue evidence so that violators know they could be seen? My good friend Tony Lake, who runs UNICEF, has remarked to me about the effectiveness of the monitoring and review mechanism established for children in armed conflict on changing the behaviour of belligerents. I think there are similar tools that could be used in other contexts too. The second area where I would like to be able to look back on better outcomes is in reducing the number of protracted crises that escalate into food security catastrophes, sometimes now verging on famine. Famine used to be ubiquitous in the human condition. 5 of my 8 great-grandparents were Irish. As a small boy, I learnt about the Irish potato famine in the 1840s. 1 million people lost their lives, another million fled. When I was born, the world was in the middle of observing probably the largest ever famine the human species has witnessed, the Great Famine in China in the early 1960s. But in the last 20 years, up to 2017, there's just been one famine in Somalia in 2011. So this horror is becoming rarer and less lethal, partly because more countries have developed and are better off, and they've built better resilience and better social protection systems. Partly also because politics in many countries forces the authorities to deal with the problem before it gets out of control. And partly because when it does threaten, the response is better. Therapeutic feeding programs, immunization, and so on dramatically reduce death rates. I know that the scriptwriters of Blade Runner 2049 are not on the same page as me on this, but I see no reason why in my lifetime famine cannot be eliminated from the human condition. Governments and fighting parties have an important role to play here. Respecting the rules of war is a primary defense against food insecurity. But I think that building on the amazing work that people like Amartya Sen and Alex de Waal have done over a long period, there's a lot more that researchers can do to allow that vision to be realised. And I hope that will be on the list of topics that researchers here in CGD are keen to take up. The third issue I think we need to find better solutions to is the world's growing caseload of long-standing refugees and IDPs. Last year at the General Assembly, we saw the launch of the new refugee framework in the UN, and I want to pay tribute to Filippo Grandi and his team for assuring that we take a more comprehensive and strategic approach to supporting refugees. I think the time is ripe for different kinds of solutions. In my last job, I was involved in developing the Jordan Compact in the run-up to the Syria conference in London in 2016. The Compact sought better solutions for refugees in Jordan, especially on livelihoods and education, and I think it's a model that can be applied elsewhere, but I think lots of other models are possible as well. Let me just be clear that I'm not suggesting that as the emergency relief coordinator, it's my role to lead on achieving all those outcomes. My role is to support others, especially the operational agencies. But as someone who's motivated basically by finding solutions to complex problems, I do want to do everything I can to help support and facilitate change on these issues. Let me show you a picture. I've spent quite a bit of time over recent years giving talks in the role of the grey mouse. Her optimism, in my opinion, is still well placed. But I now want to ensure that we save the white mouse too. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. Thank you for that visionary, comprehensive speech that you just gave us of how you see the situation now, how you see it progressing. So we might talk for a few minutes and then open it up, and I'm sure people are going to have questions or comments they want to raise. I should perhaps start off by declaring a degree of self-interest in this, which is to say that Mark and I have been friends and colleagues for many, many years. So we've worked together in many different circumstances. However, I should try to be very professional in asking you all the questions that I have been dutifully assigned. But I thought what we might just start with, Mark, is saying you were DFID, for a long time, and in the last few years, DFID has been a big champion of reforming the humanitarian system, moving to better ways of delivering humanitarian assistance, and kind of in a way leading a lot on that agenda. And now you've been in the UN system, so 43 days, maybe not long enough, but knowing you've probably by now already figured out what a lot of the UN system is thinking about these issues. How do you now look at the same agenda? Would you say, from having been inside for 43 days, kind of still broadly the same agenda? Are you more aware of some of the constraints that you couldn't see from the other side? Or so how's your perspective on the reform agenda changed, if at all?
Well, I mean, the first thing I've been really, really struck by is something I said in my talk, and it's how brilliant the people are, particularly the people I've seen around the OCHA system. If you go to a little place like Pulka or Gwoza in Borno. Gwoza is the town that Boko Haram used as their headquarters when they were holding swathes of territory across northeast Nigeria, and then it was recaptured basically by the Nigerian authorities. And if you sit in Gwoza, you are, broadly speaking, safe within the confines of the town. But what you can see from where you sit every day is land that isn't safe and is held by is sort of patrolled and subject to threat by the insurgents. And you go up there and you meet the aid workers, my colleagues and other people who are trying to relieve the suffering of people affected by this crisis, and you can't help but be impressed by their courage and commitment and drive and determination. So that's one big takeaway. I think that the thing even beyond that will stay with me a long, long time is the listening to the stories of people I've met whose lives are just ruined and devastated by these crises. So when I was in Cox's Bazar, right on the border with between Myanmar and Bangladesh last week, I heard some really, really shocking stories. So I sat in under a plastic sheet with the help of a UNFPA female professional colleague and a female interpreter, with 24 women who are part of this 539,000 who fled, and listened to their stories. And they were stories of being forced to watch their husbands, fathers, and sons killed in front of them, being raped, being subject to the most extreme forms of sexual violence, and then being forced to flee as their villages were burnt behind them. And you can see when you hear those stories what it is that motivates the tens of thousands of aid workers and why people are willing to put their own lives on the line in those circumstances. And that really is I would say, the most powerful thing. And if you're a leader in one of these organizations like me, your biggest job, I think, is to make it possible for all those people to do their best work, because that is how we maximize our impact to reduce the suffering of people facing just the most extreme experiences you can imagine. So that would be my top impression. And I recognize I'm quite an analytical person, and I try to think issues through, and I recognize what I've said is an emotional reaction to something. But I do believe that you can harness people's emotions to engage them in important ways to solve problems.
I think it's very hard, having the role that you have and having just gone through what you just described, not to have a sort of emotional dimension in the way in which one looks at this. And as you say, I think it is actually a powerful adjunct to thinking about it analytically. And I want to come back in a few minutes, if I may, to this issue of the aid workers and the changing norms. And because I really do think this is a really big problem that we face and that we need to do a better job on. But before we go there, so just to come back then on the reform agenda, because the last thing you said really for me is very important, which is that the role of the leaders, and I would say the role of those who analyze the system or finance it, the shareholders, the stakeholders, the donors, the members, is to create a system that enables these people to do the most effective job they can and to deliver the best results they can. And that's the frame in which one needs to analyze proposals for reform, which is, will these reform proposals help us to do a better job or not? And I want to sort of come back a bit to how you see that agenda now, because one of the things that's been challenging for previous attempts at trying to reform the system is that you do have a number of agencies. They all have their own governance structures, their own funding arrangements, their own constraints, and trying to get a degree of coherence has been therefore a bit more difficult. And also moving to different practices, different instruments, particularly using, for example, cash-based delivery as the norm, has proven to be more complicated than people sitting on the outside think it should be. So now my question really is, is that reform agenda still broadly in your mind the right one? Are there bits of it that you think perhaps we should be pushing more or less, and rethinking a bit how we see the trade-off between where you can get the best results in the near term and the constraints we work under?
Okay, so that's quite a big, complex question.
Well, you'll have a clear answer.
So, I am, and I think Antonio Guterres we're basically practical people. We know we don't start with a clean piece of paper. And, we've been observers and participants in this system long enough to, I think, have a sense of what you can get changed and what you have to work with and continue to improve. Kofi Annan obviously had a big go in the mid-90s to try to restructure all the institutional arrangements, and that was the last attempt at doing it, and it didn't end up where he was hoping it would end up. And I think there's only limited value to expending a lot of intellectual and emotional energy on how nice it would be to have a clean piece of paper. What I do think, though, is, as I was trying to say in my talk, there are some really big opportunities now. And one of the reasons why I think people should be confident about our ability to seize the opportunities is that I do still believe the grey mouse. I mean, if you compare, for all the problems we've got now, if you compare the average life experience of someone born now with the life experience of someone born 50 years ago, I'm talking about the modal or median human being, if you like, the prospects are better. The issue is, how do we give to the remaining 10% whose prospects haven't improved the same level of improvement that 40 or 50% have enjoyed? And that's one of the reasons why I am particularly enthused by the work that's going on to join the humanitarian and development systems up better, which is absolutely at the heart of the UN reform agenda that Antonio Guterres and Amina Mohammed have come in with and are driving forward. I'm going to just, before I go on, make one caveat to that, which is that there are still some circumstances where humanitarians need to park ourselves on the humanitarian principles, that we can't, there are some circumstances where we just mustn't get tangled up with wider political development or other streams of activity. And they tend to be circumstances where a lot of humanitarian pain and suffering is being caused by the activities of governments. Sometimes we have to park ourselves absolutely squarely behind the international legal framework, the principles of humanitarian humanity, independence, impartiality, neutrality. But there are also more cases than sometimes I think we've been willing to contemplate where you can move beyond that and try to join the system up better. The truth is there are very few humanitarian crises which are solved on their own by humanitarian interventions. So if like me, you want to be part of the solutions, your only route is to engage with other actors. And I, as a person who spent a lot of time on development issues over the last 30 years, like you, I do think that there's a big opportunity now for the kinds of reasons I was talking about earlier. And I'm keen to do what I can to ensure those opportunities are seized.
I think, over the last year or so, we've all been very excited, enthusiastic about this, what seems actually a step change in the way of bringing the humanitarian and development communities together. We've been talking about it for a decade, but it does seem to me that in the last 18 months or so, there's a practical set of steps to help us move closer. And now you see the compact, you see the way in which the World Bank Group is beginning to get involved in forced displacement and dealing with the development dimension of long-term refugees. You see the humanitarian agencies becoming more open to this relationship. On the ground, there are a few examples, so there are going to be more as time goes on. And I wonder if there are any risks that we should be aware of in this movement, because what I'm just thinking about is that there's a danger that we all rush along in this thinking this is going to solve a lot of our problems, and it will, but we don't want to make mistakes in this work that then have a kind of, stepping back or a pushback that slows it down. Do you see any things we should be careful about as we go down this road?
No, I think there obviously are a lot of risks. I've alluded to one of them already. The truth is, these are the humanitarian system, the development system, are systems that have rather enjoyed living in separate worlds for quite a long time. And, there's lots of, I'm sure there's brilliant ethnographic or anthropological studies to be done on the populations inhabiting both those systems, and there are reasons why they're different. And I think the smartest approach is the approach I observe in practice, where people are experimenting. So, in my last job, I was really keen to encourage Jim and Kristalina to pursue the thing they were doing with Peter Maurer at the ICRC for the first time ever for the World Bank to give a grant to the ICRC. And they're going to learn a lot about each other from that experience. Likewise, I'm really excited by the way in which, from the get-go, the bank's leaders are using the IDA-18 refugee window, for example, in Uganda, for example, also in the announcements made this week on Bangladesh, to begin to experiment. But the smart thing is going to be to try to make sure we learn as we go along, to have a big enough range of different kinds of experiments, to recognize that everything is context dependent, but also to be willing to test the old shibboleths. Some of the reasons why these tribes were distinct are less good than others. And testing that out a little bit, I think, is another important bit of the recipe.
So maybe just to close out on the sort of institutional issues, I want to come to OCHA itself. So you've been going through a major reform program. You had a pretty good, frank, thorough functional review a few years ago. Steve O'Brien then kind of launched that process. And now you've been there a few weeks. Your mind, that's still the broad reform agenda you want to pursue, or do you see things that you want to do differently? Too early to say?
Well, before I took up this job properly, one of the things I did in July and August was hold somewhere between 10 and 20 listening sessions with, in total, it was something like 200, so about 10% of OCHA's staff around the world. And I basically said to each of them, in groups of 10 or 15, what I want you to tell me about for the next hour is what you want me to know and what you want me to do. It was an enormous privilege, by the way. I've never had that opportunity before starting a job to go through that exercise. And one of the big takeaways was that people definitely felt that there's been this 2 years of analysis which candidly had been sapping of confidence of our financiers and also sapping of the self-confidence of our staff, and they wanted us to get on with it. And actually, part of my due diligence coming into this job was to look at the reform plan I'd inherited from Stephen, and which, by the way, was signed up to, physically signed up to, in terms of signatures on the document, by all of the senior staff. And as somebody who's, got some experience in managing big change programs, I sort of tested out and looked at, and my conclusion was it was the right program. So these things are difficult and challenging, and they're not pain-free, but I am really encouraged by the interaction we're having inside OCHA. I'm also, I have to say, because I had my first interaction with them in Geneva Monday this week, I'm incredibly grateful for the support of my donors who pay for 95% of what OCHA can do, for their endorsement of us moving forward with this. And I'm as confident as a person can be that what we're going to do is make OCHA better in very important respects. Two most important being as a better place to work for our brilliant people, and second most, even more important actually, in terms of the impact we make on our vision and our mission. Our vision is a world where people in humanitarian crises get the help they need. And I'm confident that our reform program will help us realize that vision.
Great. So before we open it out, let me just come back to that one question you raised, the issue you raised about violence. And it's partly violence against aid workers and humanitarian workers, which, as you say, has kind of gone up. But it's also a reflection of a breakdown in the norms of war, which results in violence against civilian combatants, or civilians are caught up in the process. And you said this was one of the areas where you wanted that at the end of your tenure, your term, you want to see a better outcome. So from where you are, what can you do to help push towards that outcome?
Well, I think one thing we can do, and one of my great sort of guides and heroes really in this is Peter Maurer, who's the president of the ICRC, and I've listened to him a lot on this topic. And I think one thing that we do have to do is take as our starting point the world as it is, as opposed to the world that we might wish it to be. And the truth is that not everybody buys into the same moral values that all of the people watching this and all the people sitting in this room, I'm guessing, do buy into. One thing that means is that appeals to the morality of what's right to do and what's not right to do is great for people who share the same moral outlook, but less likely to be successful for other people. And I think an area that's ripe for research is to understand the ways in which engaging with people who commit atrocities are likely to be successful. I think that there are some ways. So, for example, some recent research suggests that a focus on the legal consequences of doing things is more effective than the moral righteousness of doing things. A focus on people's actual interests may be useful. So, you know, I gave the example of the Irish potato famine. That was, in my opinion, that became the central political fact in the relationship between Ireland and the rest of the UK for 100 years. What happened was profoundly against the interests of the elites at the time in the UK who presided over it. I think some of the things that are happening now in the world are profoundly against the long-term interests of some of the people who are allowing them to happen. And I think if you start to engage on the issue in that way, you do get a bit more traction. But there's lots of other dimensions to this challenge as well. And my main point to put in front of all of you is researchers should get into it.
Good. Thank you. Let's open it up. And Rajesh, are you going to moderate it? Would you like to? Yeah.
So the way we'll do this is that we'll take probably 3 questions at a time. We have a couple of mics going around. If I call on you, please say your name, your affiliation, and then please make sure it has a question mark at the end and is brief. And you have 2 for the price of 1 as well, both Masood and Mark Locog available to answer your questions as well, so make use of them as well. So let's start. We've got a couple here. Let's start. Gentleman in the second row, lady in the third row, hello. And then we'll keep it to this side for now. Gentleman over there, and then we'll go to this side over there for the second round.
My name is Joel Charney from, I represent the Norwegian Refugee Council in Washington, and I want to play off the
Joel,
last question.
Your mic's not on, actually. There it is.
Okay, yeah, sorry. So Joel Charney from Norwegian Refugee Council. I want to build off the last question, Mark, and basically ask, given your analysis that, you know, kind of moral appeals may be futile or not working, and I certainly saw that with your predecessors, Valerie Amos and Stephen O'Brien. So how do you balance our expectation of you as kind of the leader of the global humanitarian community and sort of expected to make those moral appeals with your gut sense that these moral appeals fundamentally aren't working? So what have you thought about this, and how's that going to impact the way you relate to the Security Council, for example, or global media or world leaders and so on?
Thank you. Lady behind.
Thank you. Patty McElreevy with Interaction. Sorry. I just want to build a little bit also on what Joel said there. We really welcome the work you've been doing with OCHA and looking at how to focus internally at making them a strong, coordinating body, especially for NGOs. I mean, OCHA has really been a primary UN agency for us in how they work, and it's really great to see that you've taken that seriously. I think, though, there's a second, hat that you wear that's critically important to the NGO community, and that's the IESC as the Emergency Relief Coordinator, and also as the chair of the Interagency Standing Committee. And while that might seem to be a kind of a hollow process in some ways, a body that doesn't make a lot of sense for some, especially with the focuses on UN reform, it's one of the only places where the NGO community has an ability to be at the table, to bring issues forward, and to really have a strong voice on policy and advocacy. And we're just wondering, what is your plans for that going forward? It's in a little bit of a lull at the moment, so how are you intending to reinvigorate it and really relaunch that collective voice, and making sure that, using that picture a little bit further, that the white mice isn't the NGOs kind of just going, slowly out of the way? Thank you.
And actually, so if you wouldn't mind waiting for the second round, I just want to get a question in quickly from Monique Paria from ECHO, the Director General of ECHO, who's joined us. Could we get one in with you? I'll come to you first time in the second round.
I don't want to bypass anyone.
It's okay.
I know Mark and we meet very regularly, so I think we share globally the same approach, and I thank you, Mark, for your speech, because this is everything I could have said and I would have liked to say, and you said that in much better words. I would just like to ask you, as a donor, and we are one of the biggest donors, we are fully committed to this new way of working, to the UN reform, we were supportive of the OCHA reform, but we still struggle to see how we can continue to improve the overall efficiency of the humanitarian system. So we have committed to many things in the grand bargain, but I would like to have your views on what can still be done and how can you support on that, or can we help you, because I think it goes both ways, on improving the overall efficiency. We've worked pretty much on cash, but there are probably other things we can do. What about innovation? I think we talk a lot about that, but we still struggle also to see what we can do concretely into integrating better innovation into the humanitarian functioning. And the last point is different, but is something very dear to me, is on gender-based violence. As you know, and maybe some of you don't know, but we are taking the lead now for 18 months on the call to action. And what you said about the Rohingya situation is something that you have witnessed and we all witnessed everywhere. So how can we work better to prevent and reduce and one day eradicate this awful behavior towards young boys or young girls and women largely? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Actually, why don't we get a couple of responses to those points
Okay.
first, and then we'll work back.
So to Joel, firstly, thank you very much for your point. I should just say that your boss was among the 5 of my predecessors who I consulted and whose advice I sought before I took up this job. And Jan is somebody who wrestled every day and found his own answer to to the question that you posed to me. And the truth is, it's a tightrope, really, because on the one hand, it's not difficult to express outrage. It's not difficult to do that because there are so many things about which outrage should be expressed. And sometimes that's going to be the right thing to do. Sometimes it's going to be necessary to bite one's tongue and try to work a little bit more behind the scenes for some progress on some issues. And one thing I observed that impresses me is that across my peers in the sort of senior leadership of the whole system, I'm talking about the IASC principles in particular, there is quite a canny, not always completely pre-designed approach to division of labour. And I think that's quite a useful concept, actually, for who takes the strain on what issues. I'm not expecting that I'm going to emerge, however many years from now, criticism-free. That's not realistic. I mean, the truth is, some people will wish I had done some things or said some other things, and you just need broad enough shoulders to accept that. But I am, as I said earlier, I'm basically motivated by solutions, and I will think quite carefully about the moments where it's right to express outrage, sort of, and live with the consequences, and the moments where a different approach might be the best approach. And I'm ready to accept that some people will like some of those choices and other people will not like them so much. Thank you, Paddy, very much indeed for the point on IASC. And of course, Sam is a fantastic member of that group. What I've been really struck by, and I spoke at least once, in some cases several times, to all of the IASC principles before I took up this job. I'm really struck by people's enthusiasm for finding a way to make that group work for everybody. And you know, we had a 4-hour meeting on the 17th of September, just the principals in the room, without our support staff, which caused a certain amount of anxiety.
Among the principals.
And actually, what I took away from that is there's definitely a space where the chief executives of these big shops find it valuable to talk to each other. But also, from that discussion, we found some things that we wanted then to feed back into our systems. So I think there are, and I was talking to 3 of the principals this morning, actually, about the agenda for the next meeting, and which is on the 4th of December. And I think what we're going to want is to sustain that safe space for some discussions as a means of, identifying possible avenues into something which we can then task our colleagues to progress and serve up solutions for us, together with sometimes where we have to be in a more formal setting and just be clear, are we all signing on the dotted line on this proposition and its detailed ramifications, or aren't we? So we need to find the right balance. One thing that I think is a question that has been addressed before and perhaps not been satisfactorily answered is, how do we all in that group of IASC principles interact better with the growing proportion of the global humanitarian response system who are not represented in that room? I don't know what the answer to that is, but I do know it's a good question. And then on Monique's question, that's a very powerful question. And I think we have a big opportunity on the grand bargain, which is not just grand, but also a bargain, to really get more oomph and energy behind that again, now that Crystalline has agreed to be our eminent person and champion it. Because one of the ways you cope if the caseload is growing and the resources are not growing as fast is just make every euro, pound, dollar work harder. And the grand bargain ought to provide lots of incentives for that. I think it's a good idea to identify 2 or 3 things where we want to make specific progress on, and we had a meeting to do that in the margins of the General Assembly. But I think it's probably not the right approach to think it can all be boiled down to 2 or 3 things. So I think we'll have to come back to the whole agenda, actually. The thing that I'm particularly interested in is the scope for innovation. If my vision of a world free of famine is to come true, it won't be because it's accompanied, I fear, by a world free of violence and conflict. It will be because, as has started to happen in Somalia this year, we found ways to reach people using technology and remote monitoring and the new approaches which work even when violence is a constraint. But that's just one example of what I think should be multiple openings up of generating ideas and technologies and innovation. The reason, I haven't said this so far, but the reason this is the first place I'm giving a public speech is because I think it's been a big mistake for the world to under-research and under-invest in policy work in the humanitarian space by think tanks. So in my little way, I'm trying to support what Masood and Jeremy and others are doing and trying to hope that it's going to get very generously financed, because if you look at the reason why fewer people live lives mired by poverty now than was the case 50 years ago or 100 years ago, it comes down to science and technology and innovation. That is what drives that more than anything else. That's what's driven human progress. And the same could be true in the humanitarian space. I wish I knew the answer to how to change behavior of men toward, that's what let's be clear, behavior of men towards women and girls. Let's be honest that it's not a problem that is unique to conflict situations or to poor countries. You all said it.
Did you have anything you wanted to add?
Nope.
Okay. Everyone from CGD is furiously tweeting the thing about not enough research. Humanitarian reform. Okay, second round of questions. Gentlemen, thank you for waiting, and then we'll get the lady in front of you, and then Nancy.
Greg Graham with Save the Children. Greg Graham.
Yeah.
Just to say thank you for those opening comments, and I was struck by your opening note about you embrace the job because of the reform agenda of reduced need and improved efficiency. I think all of us are optimistic that we can find ways to be more efficient despite all the challenges. I am curious about the optimism that we can reduce need. To use your metaphor, the lives of the gray mice are definitely getting better over the years. But from where I sit, I just see more and more snakes. And we're spending a lot of time trying to rescue those white mice and the snakes from Bangladesh and Myanmar to Diffa and northern Nigeria just seem to be out there and growing. And I'm curious about the optimism.
Nicole.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm Laura Lara-Donnelly, and I'm from the State Department's PRM Bureau, more specifically under PRP. And you said that a reform agenda is needed, but will this agenda ever include migrants? They are a significant portion of the global population, being 1 in 7 of the people who currently exist. And they're subject to the same threats as refugees and IDPs, namely sexual violence and trafficking. And yet there's no Geneva Convention for them. Their status is not exclusively an economic issue, but also a humanitarian one as well. Do you foresee a compact for migrants in the future happening anytime soon?
And then, Nancy, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Mark, for coming first to a development center. I think it says something about your capacity as a leader to think long-term, even as you cope with short-term situations. And thank you for this good idea, which I interpreted as research not only on eliminating famine, but tell the rich world the long-run costs associated with short-term negligence. This morning, I learned, to my surprise, I hadn't known, that the peacekeeping work in Liberia of the UN will end at a very unfortunate moment when there are going to be elections and there could be difficulties. And it reminds me of the reality that we often have seemingly stable states that then, for one reason or another, go back into being fragile, conflict-affected, and become another round of humanitarian crisis. And then the worry that the apparent rising needs on the humanitarian side are going to crowd out the long-run development work. So within the UN system, I'm just curious if you have voice on bringing the long-run to short-run issues, and that might include, I don't know if this is the right example, is there anything that you can be saying about the risks associated with withdrawal at difficult moments from countries of UN peacekeepers?
Okay.
Okay, so to Greg's question, I think, as I said, my first job was working on the famine in Ethiopia in the mid-1980s, and I suppose that if you don't believe things can be better, probably you don't do this for 33 years and X. But I also happen to believe that the facts, I know facts aren't kind of universally popular in the modern world, but I still quite like them. I do believe that they prove progress. The Steven Pinker book that the Grey Mouse enjoyed, I liked too. Someone told me it's Bill Gates' favorite book. If you haven't read it, you really need to read it. But also another one of my favorite books is a book called The Rational Optimist, which charts progress. The reason I like those books is because they reinforce the view that things can be better. I think you have to face up to the fact that we're in a bad period. No question, we're in a bad period, and we have been since 2010, really. We shouldn't fall for the fallacy of believing a bad period has to be continued, because it doesn't. I think your question on migrants and refugees is a great question, and the UN at the General Assembly last year made some progress on some dimensions of people moving and why they move and where they move to and how that can be managed for the world as a whole. Not every dimension, including some that you touch on, but I think that's clearly in a globalized world a thing countries working together and institutions supporting them have to get better at. Monday or Tuesday, I'm having my first meeting in this new job with Louise Arbour, who is the person at the top of the UN who's trying to progress a lot of these things. And you sort of motivate me to provide all the help I can to support Louise, because I think it's a really important set of issues we need to try and do better on. So to Nancy's question, two things to say, really. I mean, the UN obviously is both a stage where the member states come together and agree or don't agree as member states, and we in the UN are also actors. And the UN, the same word is used, or same initials used to describe both the stage and the actors. What Masood asked me as his first question, what's different looking from the inside to outside? Partly it's you understand better the difference between the stage and the actors. But to your point, we are receivers of what, for example, the Security Council, which is the member states playing out on the stage, decide. We're not the determiners of that as a Secretariat. Equally, we have a responsibility and should try to be shapers of our authorising environment. And one of the things, again, that made this an easy question for me to answer when Antonio called me. I was actually on the 13th floor of the World Bank building at the time I took the call, in an irony I kind of quite enjoyed, to be called by the head of the UN to, sort of thing. One of the other things that made it an easy question to answer was because part of what he's put in place is effectively a cabinet system where every Thursday the most senior staff, Antonio and Amina Mohammed, the Deputy Secretary General, and the heads of the main departments meet effectively as a cabinet with an agenda and try to work together to identify what part we each need to play in tackling problems which we all know none of us can solve just by our own department acting. And Liberia is a discussion we've had since I joined. So the Security Council, the member states, take decisions about peacekeeping operations on the basis of, we hope, advice and analysis from us. But we also recognise, I think, a need to try to shape the authorising environment. And what you say maybe motivates us to try harder at that.
Okay, Masood.
So I do want to say something which is partly triggered by what you said, Greg, and partly sort of, I think in a way it's quite linked to what Nancy was getting at as well, which is that I think I'm also in the camp that believes that, if you look at the world as a whole, if you look at developing countries as a whole, there's almost no way that you can argue that things aren't much better today than they were 50 years ago or 20 years ago. That said, it's also the case that there are a subset of areas, communities, problems, which have turned out to be more protracted and harder to deal with than we had thought. And I think it is not unreasonable for us to step back and say, are we actually dealing with them in the right way? So, and it's not just a question of are we doing the bits of humanitarian work or development work or peacekeeping or pre-peacekeeping working in fragile states better. But I think what we haven't fully internalized is that a common feature of many of these situations is that they cannot be resolved except by dealing across silos. So these are the places where you cannot only do humanitarian work, you cannot only do peacekeeping, you cannot only do development, you can't wait for one to finish before the other comes in, and that the way we used to think of these things where you do, peacekeeping and then humanitarian, then the development people would arrive, in these situations doesn't make sense. And so we're making efforts now to try and think differently about them. But I don't think that all our decisions are rational in that sense. So to come back to Nancy's point, which is you may be making a decision to pull out peacekeepers without fully internalizing that the evidence shows that many of the countries that have come out of conflict and appear to be relatively stable but are still quite fragile may then quite easily fall back into a situation where you would be back in there dealing at a higher cost. And so what I do feel, and this is maybe where sort of maybe the gray mouse isn't quite seeing the whole picture, is that there are parts of that world in which we live today where I don't think we have really with confidence, we can say with confidence that the instruments we have in place and the way we apply them will lead to better outcomes unless we do things differently. So I think part of the challenge for all of us is to say, how are we going to do things differently and better so that the whole picture, not just the average, begins to look better in the next 10 years.
Okay, look, given that we only have a couple of minutes left, if people have very brief questions, I'm probably going to take 2 more, and then we're going to have to wind up. So lady in the purple, you had your hand up for a while, and let's get the young lady here in the black and white. And that will be it. Apologies if we didn't get you in.
Hello, Anita Mengedi, Acting Deputy Assistant Administrator, Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance, USAID. Mark, I welcome your comments, and I just have to say for the optimist point that I have a greeting card on my desk, and it says, if I didn't laugh, I'd cry. And then you open it up, and it says, that's it. But I think it is apropos that you're here at the Center for Global Development, and I think one of the things that we need to do, and sorry, but it was a question that made this come to my mind, is that we need to get away from this notion that humanitarian assistance is a short-term endeavor. Displacement continues on average 17 years. ICRC's biggest crises, they have been involved for 23 years. If you look at appeals, or whatever we're calling consolidated appeals these days because they get their names changed, they're mostly the same ones as there were last year and the year before that and the year before that. USAID does 5-year development plans. That means someone is displaced for 3 5-year development plans. But so it's not just so much how do we think about long-term issues in short-term crises, because quite honestly, except for a few earthquakes in, let's say, Japan, our response tends not to be very brief. So my question is, because I know you want a question in here, is in that knowledge, there is so much work to be done on both sides of these silos, and I would say a lot of the way we fund things it hurts us more than it helps us. I agree that we need to have some spaces where there's just humanitarian only, but I think that there is so much more that needs to be done in realistically approaching a new crisis. I know I was asked during the beginning of the Syria crisis to write a 6-month plan, and I asked if I could write a 3-year plan, and I was told no. So I'm just wondering, both what you're trying to do in the UN, but if you could say a little bit more about what donors need to be thinking about, I'd appreciate that.
Okay, and then last question.
Hello, my name is Carol Tajero. I'm a graduate student at Syracuse University. You were talking about UN reforms, especially about bridging the humanitarian and development actors. So my question is, what will this reform look like, especially in regards to the Secretary General's focus on early action? Thank you.
Okay, so I mean, to Anita's question firstly, I was in Darfur in January. It's the first time I've been there actually, and what we've had in Darfur since 2003 is 13 years of humanitarian response on one level. Actually though, I think what we've had is 1 year of response 13 times. And we're now finally getting to the point where we may be able to have several years of response, which is trying to deal with the real problem, or move us on from that 1 year 13 times. And of course, one of the big elements of the grand bargain is that medium-term thing. Now, I do completely recognize that decision-making systems and mandates and institutional responsibilities in the financing countries vary, and it's easier for some than for others to be allowed to write the 3-year plan. But I have to say, I think it would be better value for money for everybody if more people could write and finance the 3-year plan and not just have to deal with the 1-year plan. So to Carol's question, I think there's a lot of dimensions actually to that, but one of the things that was better about certainly the Somali response to this year's crisis, and I worked on the 92 famine in Somalia and then on the 2011 famine in Somalia, and what I really had a heart-stopping moment in December last year when I started reading the FuseNet's reports. It was not my ambition as someone working in this space for a long time to have to respond to another famine in Somalia. And in fact, what happened was that there was early action and money was mobilized and the quality of the response was better. And that's the reason why there hasn't been a famine. The drought actually was worse this year than in either of the 2 famines I was involved with thousands of other people in dealing with. So a really catastrophic outcome involving the loss of lives running into 7 figures was absolutely an available outcome. And the reason it didn't happen was because action was early and better quality and so on. One of the things that, to give me a chance to repeat what I said at the beginning, when you read the full version of what I was going to tell you, if you'd given me, Masood, 90 minutes, you will see in there is reference to mediation and better analysis and conflict prevention interventions. That is one of the things that's a great personal passion of Antonio Guterres's. Now, so my sort of summary answer to your question is we've populated some of the things that we need to do on this reform thing and early action, but there's a lot more population of other activities to do, and that's one of the things that the various governing frameworks that he's put in place for the UN will be trying to get to grips with when we have our first set of meetings the week after next.
Okay. So do you want to just close?
I'm good, thank you.
Okay. So with that, everyone, I just want to say thank you for joining us, and please thank Masood and Mark Locog for this afternoon. Thank you, Mark. Very